Imagine accepting a job that promises a fresh start, only to discover the child you've been hired to care for holds a secret that could shatter everything you thought you knew. A desperate mother, a wealthy millionaire, and a child caught in the middle. What happens when the truth comes crashing down and the past comes to haunt her? In the world of luxury and lies, one woman's simple act of kindness could unravel a story far darker than she ever expected. Stay tuned, because you won't believe what she uncovers next. The cold wind swept through the narrow alley as Emma stood frozen, her hands wrapped tightly around the straps of a worn-out bag. Her eyes, once full of hope and warmth, now reflected the exhaustion of years spent fighting a relentless battle. She had never imagined that this would be her life, struggling to make ends meet, constantly grappling with loss, and fighting for a future she could barely see. Emma's life had once been filled with laughter. She remembered the days when she and her husband, James, would sit by the window of their tiny apartment, making plans for the future. They dreamed of a better life, one that would be full of joy, love, and family. But all of that came crashing down the night James was taken from her, taken in a tragic car accident that would forever change everything. The memory of that night still haunted her. The screeching tires, the impact, the deafening silence that followed. She remembered waking up in the sterile, bright hospital room, her body battered and bruised, her heart torn apart. The doctor's words echoed in her ears like a cruel joke. "I'm sorry, your husband didn't make it." The emptiness she felt that day was like nothing she had ever known. James was gone, and she was left with nothing but the weight of grief pressing against her chest. But the worst part came after she left the hospital. Alone, her world had collapsed. She was left to navigate life as a single mother, carrying the unbearable weight of loss, while raising a child, Sam, who was only a few months old. Raising him had been a challenge, not just because of the emotional scars she carried, but because of the financial burden. Her savings quickly dwindled as she juggled low-paying jobs, working long hours, doing everything she could to put food on the table and keep a roof over Sam's head. Each day was a struggle, and every night she would lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long she could keep going. She thought about her husband, about the promises they made, about the future they had planned. Those promises felt like they belonged to someone else, someone who still had hope. But Emma was different now. She had to survive for Sam, and in doing so, she had to silence the voice in her head that screamed of her own misery. It was easier that way. As she looked out the window that day, Emma's thoughts wandered back to her past, to a time when her pain began. She wasn't always a mother. Before Sam, there was another child, someone she had lost long before Sam had been born. It felt like a distant dream, a life she could hardly recall, but the memory of it was forever etched in her heart. She was young, barely out of her teens, when she found herself pregnant. She had been so excited, so full of dreams. She imagined holding her baby in her arms, taking her baby home from the hospital, and beginning a new chapter in her life. But fate had other plans. One fateful day, Emma gave birth, but the delivery was complicated, leaving her unconscious for days. When she finally awoke, she was greeted by the cold, empty gaze of her parents, who were standing at her bedside. Their words crushed her. "You lost the baby. There was nothing we could do." At first, Emma couldn't comprehend it. The shock was too much. She begged them to tell her more, to explain what had happened, but the answers were vague, and the details were scarce. Her parents spoke in hushed tones, as though they feared the truth would break her more than it already had. They told her the baby had died, that there had been complications. But something about their story never felt right. Emma tried to remember the details, tried to piece together the fragments of those few, fleeting moments she had spent with her child. She never saw the baby's face. She never held the tiny, fragile body. Her memories were filled with blank spaces where her baby should have been. It was as if they had taken something from her, a piece of her soul that she would never get back. For years, Emma wrestled with the pain of losing that child, but the grief was tempered by a nagging suspicion. Was it true? Was the baby really gone? Or had something else happened? Her parents never answered her questions directly. Every time she asked about the adoption papers, the hospital, or anything that might explain what had happened, they shut her down. It's better to move on, they would say. Let go. You have Sam now. Focus on him. But deep down, Emma knew that something wasn't right. The questions gnawed at her, and the truth lingered just out of reach. Yet she couldn't bring herself to confront her parents, to ask them for the answers she so desperately needed. She had a child to raise now. She had no time for the ghosts of the past. Years had passed since that tragedy, and in some ways, Emma had forced herself to forget. But the memories never truly faded. They sat quietly in the back of her mind, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And now, as she stood there staring out the window at the world moving around her, she could feel those old wounds beginning to reopen. Her life, which had been a series of sacrifices and compromises, was about to take an unexpected turn. It was in these moments, in her quiet despair, that she began to wonder, could fate be cruel enough to take another child from her? Could her pain be more than just the loss of a husband? Could there be more to the story of her lost baby, a story that she hadn't yet uncovered? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound, a knock at the door. Emma blinked, startled from her reverie. She walked over slowly, wiping the stray tear from her cheek, and opened the door to find a small flyer in the hands of the mailman. It was an advertisement for a nanny job, one that seemed too good to be true. A live-in position with a wealthy family. The salary was good, the accommodation was provided, and most importantly, it promised a chance for a fresh start. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she read the details. This could be the break she had been hoping for. Maybe this job could provide her with the opportunity she so desperately needed to build a better life for herself and Sam. She couldn't waste time thinking about the past anymore. She had to take this chance. Sam was her priority. She had to do everything she could to give him a better future. Emma's eyes scanned the details again, just to be sure, and a glimmer of hope sparked inside her chest. Live-in nanny needed. High salary. Accommodation provided. Must have experience with children. Immediate start. Contact details below. It was too good to be true. In a world where jobs barely paid enough to keep food on the table, this seemed like a dream. The pay was far more than she could have ever imagined, and the promise of housing meant she wouldn't have to worry about the rent she was always a month behind on. Her thoughts drifted momentarily to Sam. How would she explain this to him? How would she tell him she was leaving? A sharp pang of guilt twisted in her stomach. Stay focused, Emma, she whispered to herself. You're doing this for him. The weight of her decision settled on her shoulders. She had no choice. The bills kept piling up, and no matter how many hours she worked, it never seemed enough. She could barely make ends meet. But this job was a chance to make something of herself again. Maybe, just maybe, it would provide the fresh start she'd been praying for. Emma grabbed her phone, dialing the number at the bottom of the flyer. Her hands trembled slightly as she pressed the phone to her ear. The ringing felt like an eternity. When a voice finally picked up, it was calm and professional. Hello, this is the Manson family. How may I help you? Hi, Emma said, her voice steady despite the nervousness she felt. I'm calling about the nanny position you've advertised. I'm very interested. There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a polite, We've had quite a few applicants, but we'll be happy to hear more about you. Emma introduced herself, speaking with the confidence she had lost in recent years. She explained her experience with children, the years she had spent raising Sam on her own, and how she was looking for a new opportunity. The conversation flowed smoothly, and before long, the voice on the other end of the line informed her that they would like to meet her in person. Emma felt a rush of relief flood her chest. A few days later, she found herself at the gates of a sprawling mansion. It was a place she had only seen in movies. Large, imposing, beautiful, and sterile. She stood outside for a moment, taking in the grandeur of it all. Could she really do this? Could she really walk into this world and leave her old life behind? Taking a deep breath, Emma rang the doorbell. A tall, composed woman answered, dressed in a simple yet elegant uniform. You must be Emma, the woman said, offering a smile. I'm Mrs. Watson, the household manager. Please come in. The inside of the house was just as impressive as the outside, opulent but cold, decorated with expensive furniture and polished wood. Emma felt out of place, like a piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. She followed Mrs. Watson through the vast corridors, feeling the weight of her own uncertainty. After what felt like an eternity of small talk, Emma was finally introduced to the man who had placed the ad, Richard Manson, the wealthy widower. He was tall, his face hardened by grief, his eyes distant, as though they hadn't seen warmth in years. His words were brief, and he didn't seem to take much interest in her beyond the surface. But Emma could sense the weight of his own burdens, the exhaustion in his demeanor, the coldness in his voice. Yet despite all of this, the job offer came. Richard's brief handshake, his lack of emotion, didn't matter. Emma had been hired. The salary was just as good as advertised, and he promised the accommodation would be comfortable. As she walked out of the mansion that afternoon, Emma couldn't believe it. She had done it. She had gotten the job. The fresh start she had longed for was within her grasp. But as the euphoria of the moment wore off, the weight of her decision started to sink in. She hadn't even told Sam yet, and with a pang of guilt, she realized that leaving him behind with her parents was the only option she had. She couldn't afford to lose this opportunity. That night, after a sleepless few hours, Emma spoke to her parents. The conversation was difficult. She could see the disappointment in their eyes as she explained the opportunity she had been given. It wasn't easy to leave Sam behind, but they assured her they would take good care of him while she worked. The pain of leaving him lingered in her chest, but she pushed it aside. This was for him, for a future she could give him, one where they wouldn't have to struggle anymore. Emma packed her bags, kissed Sam goodbye, and left the next morning, her heart heavy yet filled with a sense of determination. She would return. She would make things better for both of them. And in that moment, she could only hope that this decision would be the key to unlocking a life beyond the hardships of her past. Little did she know, the road ahead would lead her to truths more shocking than she could ever have imagined. The mansion was a place of silence, a silence so thick that it seemed to suffocate everything within its walls. Emma had never imagined that a home could feel so empty, even with the grand furniture, the shimmering chandeliers, and the lavish decorations. The air was heavy, thick with a sense of isolation that made her uneasy as she stood in the expansive living room, her footsteps echoing as she walked across the marble floor. Richard Manson was a man of few words, his stoic demeanor matched by the stark coldness of his home. The first few days had been awkward, to say the least. Emma had been assigned a small, elegant room that overlooked a beautifully manicured garden, but the luxury of it all felt distant, almost irrelevant. She wasn't here for the luxury. She was here for Jamie, the child she was meant to care for, the child who was now her responsibility. Jamie was a ghost in this house, a shadow that moved through the rooms with a quiet sadness that seemed to seep into the very walls. Emma's first encounter with her had been brief, and it left a lasting impression. The young girl barely acknowledged her when they first met, her big eyes glazed with apathy. Jamie's hair, once curly and full, now hung limp around her face, as though she had stopped taking any joy in the world around her. The child's room was the darkest in the house, tucked away in a far corner of the mansion, as though it too had been forgotten by time. The walls were painted in shades of pale blue, but the furniture was sparse, with only a few stuffed animals and a large, empty bed. It felt like a room abandoned by life itself. When Emma first walked in, she found Jamie sitting at the far end of the room, staring out the window with a distant look in her eyes. "Jamie," Emma called softly, trying to break through the silence. The girl didn't respond. She didn't even turn her head. Instead, she remained still, as though Emma wasn't even there. Emma felt a pang in her chest, a tight knot of helplessness forming. She had hoped, desperately hoped, that Jamie would be the one to fill this cold, empty house with some semblance of life. But the girl seemed utterly disconnected from the world around her. The days that followed weren't much different. Emma would try to engage with Jamie, offering her little snacks, books, or toys, but the child's reactions were always the same: a vacant stare or a simple nod, followed by silence. Emma couldn't help but feel a growing sense of frustration. She knew something was wrong, but what could she do? How could she reach a child who was so deeply withdrawn? Meanwhile, Richard Manson, the millionaire, was hardly ever around. He spent his days locked away in his study, his office, or in meetings that seemed to last for hours on end. The only time Emma saw him was during brief, polite exchanges when he would ask her if Jamie had eaten or if she needed anything. His voice was flat, his tone distant. He barely seemed to care about the child he had taken in, or perhaps he just didn't know how to. At night, the mansion fell into an even deeper silence. Emma could hear Richard moving through the house, his heavy footsteps on the marble floors, his muffled voice on the phone, but the conversations were always brief, businesslike, and never personal. It was as if he had become a mere shadow of the man he once was, consumed by work and the overwhelming grief of losing his wife. Emma often found herself wandering the vast halls, trying to distract herself from the loneliness that crept in with each passing hour. She would find herself in the kitchen late at night, staring at the pots and pans, wondering if there was something more she could do to fill the emptiness of the mansion, to make this place feel like home for Jamie. But no matter how hard she tried, the atmosphere remained the same, cold, distant, and lifeless. It wasn't until the third night that Emma finally had a glimpse of what was really happening in this household. She had been sitting in a library, reading a book to pass the time, when she heard the faint sound of crying. The sobs were muffled, but they were unmistakable. Emma's heart jumped into her throat as she stood up quickly, dropping the book onto the couch. She rushed toward the source of the sound, her mind racing with thoughts of what could be wrong. When she reached Jamie's room, the door was slightly ajar. Emma hesitated for a moment before gently pushing it open. Inside, she found Jamie sitting on the floor, her knees pulled up to her chest, her face buried in her hands as she sobbed uncontrollably. The sight was almost unbearable. The little girl, so small and fragile, breaking down in a room that felt as if it had never known warmth or love. "Jamie," Emma whispered, stepping softly into the room. "It's okay, sweetheart. What's wrong?" Jamie looked up at her, her tear-streaked face twisted in sadness. Her eyes, usually so empty, were now filled with pain. She shook her head, unable to speak, but her lips trembled, and Emma could see the deep sadness etched into her face. There was a rawness to it, a pain that seemed far too much for a child to carry. Emma knelt beside her, reaching out a tentative hand. "It's okay. You don't have to talk if you don't want to, but I'm here for you." For a moment, there was no response. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Jamie spoke, her words broken and full of sorrow. "I miss her," Jamie said. "I miss my mom." Emma's heart ached at the words. She knew that Jamie had lost her mother, but she hadn't fully understood the depth of that loss. It was clear now, from the sadness in the child's eyes, that Jamie's grief ran far deeper than anything Emma had expected. "I know," Emma said softly, her voice filled with compassion. "I know it's hard, sweetie. I really do." But even as she spoke those words, Emma couldn't help but feel the enormity of the situation. Richard, the millionaire who had taken her in, had become so consumed by his own grief and work that he had failed to see what was happening to his own child. And Jamie, left to face the pain of losing her mother alone, had become a shell of herself, her voice lost, her spirit broken. As Emma sat beside Jamie, holding her close in the quiet of the darkened room, she realized that the mansion, despite its grandeur, was nothing more than a cage for a broken family, trapped by their own sorrow. And Emma, caught in the middle of it all, was the only one who seemed to care enough to try and heal the wounds. But could she do it? Could she help Jamie find her voice again? Help her find the light in the darkness? The answer was unclear, but Emma knew one thing for certain. This mansion, filled with wealth and opulence, would not be enough to heal the hurt that ran so deep in this family. It would take more than money and luxury. It would take love, patience, and a willingness to fight for the happiness of the child who had been left behind in the wake of so much tragedy. And Emma, despite the growing weight on her shoulders, was determined to be the one who fought for Jamie's future. The days in the mansion started to blend together. Quiet mornings that turned into long, drawn-out afternoons, the only sound breaking through the silence being the faint rustle of leaves from the trees outside. Emma had quickly learned the rhythm of the house. Richard, the distant millionaire, always holed up in his office, the phone ringing constantly with demands from the outside world. And Jamie? Well, Jamie was always somewhere in the house, either sitting alone in her room or wandering aimlessly, her face always blank, her eyes void of emotion. But time had a strange way of changing things, even in places that felt frozen in grief. Slowly, Emma's presence began to make a subtle difference in the heavy atmosphere. She had never been one to give up easily, and as the days passed, she refused to allow Jamie to remain a shadow of a child forever. Every morning, Emma greeted Jamie with the same warm smile, even though the girl would often look away, pretending not to notice. Emma made it a point to be patient, never pressing too hard, never forcing a connection. She simply was there, with her warmth, her unwavering kindness. At first, it seemed like nothing was getting through, but Emma knew better than to give up. It was small gestures at first, bringing Jamie a cup of warm tea when she was sitting quietly by the window, reading stories to her, even offering her a game of cards or a puzzle. Every day, she tried something new, gently nudging Jamie out of her shell, but the child remained distant. Still, Emma persisted. She refused to let Jamie feel alone. Weeks passed before Emma saw the first sign of change. One morning, after finishing her usual chores, Emma sat down by the piano in the living room, running her fingers over the keys. It had been a long time since she'd played, but music had always been her escape, her way of reconnecting with the joy she thought she had lost. The soft melody filled the quiet house, and as Emma played, she couldn't help but notice that Jamie was standing at the doorway, watching her with curious eyes. For the first time in a long while, Emma saw a flicker of something in the girl's expression. She was no longer just staring blankly. There was a trace of interest, a spark of something like wonder. Emma continued playing, gently coaxing the music out of the old piano. She didn't stop. She didn't try to speak. She simply let the music fill the space between them, hoping that it would bridge the gap. To her surprise, Jamie didn't retreat. Instead, she slowly moved closer, then sat down cross-legged on the floor, resting her chin in her hands, her gaze fixed on the piano. Emma could feel her heart beat faster, not from excitement, but from a quiet hope. Maybe this was the beginning. When the song ended, Emma looked up from the piano, catching Jamie's gaze. The girl didn't say anything at first, but her lips twitched, almost as if she were about to smile. Emma smiled back, hopeful. "Do you like music?" Emma asked softly. Jamie nodded slowly. "It's nice," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't much, but it was a start." "That's good to hear," Emma said. "Would you like to try playing with me?" Jamie hesitated, her eyes flicking to the keys of the piano. There was a moment of silence, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was hopeful. Slowly, Jamie stood up and walked toward Emma, her small fingers brushing the keys gently. Emma beamed. "Go ahead, play whatever you want. There's no wrong way to play music." And so, the girl began, tentatively at first, pressing one finger down at a time. The notes were disjointed, out of tune, but it didn't matter. Emma joined her, playing softly beside her, guiding her hands to the right keys, showing her how to press down gently. "Like this," Emma said softly, her voice a gentle whisper of encouragement. Jamie tried again, and this time the notes flowed together a little more smoothly, a rhythm taking shape. The two of them played together for a while, quietly, joyfully, without pressure or expectation. The music filled the room, and as it did, the air seemed to lift, the tension in the house breaking ever so slightly. From that moment on, something shifted. It was as if the ice around Jamie's heart had begun to crack. She still wasn't the playful, bubbly child Emma hoped she would be, but there was a noticeable change. She started responding to Emma's questions, short answers at first, but they were answers nonetheless. Her eyes followed Emma's movements a little more closely. She even started asking Emma about the stories she used to read to her. One evening, as Emma prepared dinner in the kitchen, she heard the sound of small footsteps behind her. She turned around, surprised to find Jamie standing there, looking up at her with a shy, tentative expression. "Can I help?" Jamie asked, her voice soft, but for the first time, there was something in it, a hint of eagerness, a glimmer of curiosity. Emma smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. "Of course. You can help me set the table, if you like." It was a small thing, really, setting the table, but it was a step. It was a sign that Jamie was beginning to engage with her surroundings, to take an interest in something beyond the sadness that had clung to her for so long. The act of helping felt like an unspoken invitation to be part of the world again. As the days passed, Emma continued to notice more of these small changes. Jamie began to ask more questions, simple things like, "What's your favorite color?" or "How did you learn to cook?" Emma reveled in these moments, answering with the same warmth she always did. There was no rush, no urgency. She simply let Jamie's walls fall, bit by bit, at her own pace. Soon, they were playing together more often, with Jamie's laughter becoming a rare but precious sound in the house. One afternoon, Emma found herself sitting on the floor of the living room, surrounded by scattered toys, as Jamie built a tower with colorful blocks. It was simple, but Emma's heart soared. "You're really good at this," Emma said, smiling at Jamie's concentration as she carefully stacked the blocks. Jamie looked up at her and smiled, really smiled for the first time since Emma had arrived. "I like it," she said simply, then turned her attention back to her tower. And that was all Emma needed to know. The quiet, brooding child who had once been a stranger in her own home was now slowly coming alive again. She wasn't all the way there, not yet, but she was moving in the right direction. The change wasn't immediate, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. And that, for Emma, was enough. As the weeks wore on, the mansion that had once felt like a tomb began to feel a little more like a home. There were still moments of silence, still traces of sadness in Jamie's eyes, but the connection between them had deepened. Emma knew that healing would take time, but she was determined to help Jamie through it. Together, they would find their way back from the shadows. And for the first time in a long while, Emma allowed herself to hope again. Hope that the warmth she offered would be enough to mend what had been broken. The soft warmth of the afternoon sun poured through the windows of the mansion, casting long, golden beams across the polished floors. It was a peaceful day, a rare moment of calm in the otherwise silent house. Emma sat in the living room, a cup of tea in hand, her thoughts wandering as she watched Jamie, who was playing with her toys on the floor. It had been weeks since the girl had begun to show signs of life again. Jamie's laughter was becoming more frequent, her small conversations with Emma growing longer each day. Emma felt a strange sense of peace watching the child. It was as though they had finally begun to carve out a space for themselves in the cold expanse of the mansion. There were still moments of silence, of course, but they were becoming less frequent. It was a good sign. As she sipped her tea, Emma's mind began to drift. She thought back to the past, the baby she had lost, the child she had never been allowed to see. The pain of that loss had never truly left her. But every day she spent with Jamie, the feeling of missing something deepened. She had come to care for Jamie in a way she hadn't expected. But the nagging question, the one that had haunted her since she first set foot in the mansion, still lingered in the back of her mind. Was it possible that Jamie was the child she had lost so many years ago? Emma shook the thought away. It seemed impossible, but the feeling, the sense of familiarity that lingered whenever she looked at Jamie, it was undeniable. The way Jamie's eyes would brighten when Emma smiled at her, the way she clung to her hand sometimes, as if she had been waiting for someone like Emma to be there. It was as though they had known each other forever, even though they were strangers. But today, something was different. Jamie, who had been playing quietly with her stuffed animals, rolled onto her back to stretch. The movement caught Emma's attention, and she glanced up from her cup of tea just in time to see Jamie's shirt ride up slightly as she shifted on the floor. That's when Emma saw it. A small, faint birthmark on the side of Jamie's lower back, just above her hip. It was barely noticeable, a subtle brownish spot, but it was unmistakable. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she stared at it. Her heart began to race. The cup of tea forgotten in her hands. The mark. It was the same. It was exactly the same as the birthmark on the child she had lost. The memories flooded her like a wave, crashing over her with a force she hadn't expected. She saw herself in the sterile hospital room, the aftermath of the traumatic delivery. The doctor's words echoed in her ears. "You lost the baby, Emma. There was nothing we could do." She had believed them, believed her parents when they told her that the baby had died. They had shown her nothing but a blank, cold hospital room. But now, seeing that birthmark, that undeniable resemblance, Emma felt the world tilt beneath her. Her mind flashed back to that day. She had been unconscious for hours, the pain of childbirth lingering in her body as she struggled to wake up. But when she did, everything was different. Her parents had told her that the baby was gone, that she had been too late to save her. But they hadn't shown her the child. They hadn't let her say goodbye. Emma had always wondered about that. Why hadn't they allowed her to see her baby? Why hadn't they let her hold the child, even just for a moment? And now, here she was looking at Jamie, who had the same birthmark, the same distinctive spot she had seen on her own child. A birthmark that was uniquely hers, and hers alone. Emma's hands trembled as she put the teacup down on the table, suddenly too afraid to hold it any longer. She leaned forward, her gaze fixed on Jamie. The child had rolled onto her stomach now, completely unaware of the turmoil swirling inside Emma. Emma's heart was pounding in her chest. Her breath quickened, and for a moment, she could barely think straight. She had to know. She had to understand what was happening. Was Jamie the baby she had lost? Could it be possible that the child she had thought dead was actually alive? Emma shook her head, trying to calm the storm of thoughts in her mind. It didn't make sense. It couldn't be true. The adoption papers, the stories her parents had told her, they all said otherwise. But the birthmark, that birthmark could not be ignored. It was too specific, too unique. It felt like a sign. Slowly, carefully, Emma rose from her chair, her body moving as though it was on autopilot. She walked toward Jamie, trying to steady her breathing, trying to calm her racing heart. Her feet felt heavy with each step, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "Jamie," Emma said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Jamie didn't respond immediately, but Emma could see the slight shift in the girl's posture as she sat up and turned toward her. The child looked up at Emma, her big eyes wide and expectant, as though waiting for something. Emma took a deep breath, steadying herself. She couldn't ask Jamie directly, not now, not like this. But the questions burned inside her, demanding answers she wasn't ready for. "Do you have a birthmark, Jamie?" Emma asked, trying to keep her voice casual, trying to make the question sound innocent, as though it were a passing curiosity. Jamie's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Emma thought she might not answer. But then, the girl nodded, her expression wary. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Right here." She pointed to the side of her back. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She could barely contain the rising flood of emotion inside her, but she forced herself to stay composed. "That's a pretty special birthmark," Emma said softly, her eyes never leaving Jamie's face. "I have one like it." Jamie didn't respond, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, like she was processing something in her own quiet way. Emma could feel the tension thick in the air. There were no words for what Emma was feeling. She could barely put it into thoughts, let alone express it aloud. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. It wasn't just curiosity now. It was a sense of dread, a sense of hope that Emma wasn't sure she was ready to confront. The more she looked at Jamie, the more she saw traces of the child she had lost. The memories, the feelings she had pushed aside for so long, began to resurface. As she stood there, staring at the girl in front of her, Emma realized one thing. She had to know the truth. No matter how painful it might be, she had to uncover the secrets buried in the past. The birthmark was just the beginning. And with that thought, a new sense of determination settled in her chest. She would find out the truth, no matter what it cost. Tonight, it felt heavier. Emma stood in the library, her hand gripping the old wooden bookshelf, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had spent the entire afternoon rummaging through drawers, searching through countless old books, photographs, and papers in an attempt to make sense of what had been happening around her. But nothing had prepared her for what she would find. She wasn't looking for this, not really, not consciously, but when she pulled out an old, faded album from the bottom shelf of the cabinet, something in her gut told her that she was about to uncover something that would change everything. Emma had never been one to go digging into people's private affairs, especially not her employers. But in the pit of her stomach, a gut-wrenching feeling told her it was time. There was something off about this whole situation, something she couldn't shake. The birthmark on Jamie's back had been the catalyst, the spark that lit the fire of doubt. And now, as she flipped through the pages of that album, she finally found the confirmation she had been subconsciously searching for. The photograph was tucked neatly behind a page with a beautiful, handwritten note in the corner. Emma's fingers trembled as she carefully pulled the photo free. It was a picture of a baby, wrapped in a white blanket, lying peacefully in a crib. The small, delicate features, the baby's closed eyes, the tiny fingers clutching at the air. It was unmistakable. Emma's breath hitched in her throat as she stared at the photo. The baby in the picture was the same as the one she had lost so many years ago, the child she had never been allowed to see, the child her parents had told her had died after childbirth. But here, in this picture, the baby was alive. The resemblance was so striking, so undeniable that Emma could hardly breathe. Her heart pounded in her chest. This couldn't be real. She turned the photo over, almost as though she expected to see her parents' handwriting, to see the name of the baby they had claimed was dead. But there was no name written on the back, just a date. And a location, a hospital she didn't recognize. Emma's hand shook as she placed the photo down on the desk. Her mind raced, trying to process what she had just discovered. How could this be? Was it possible? Could the child in this photo actually be hers? The baby she'd been told was gone forever? Her heart twisted with a flood of emotions. Confusion, grief, anger, betrayal. Her mind couldn't settle on one thought. But there was no denying what this photograph represented. The baby in the photo was the child she thought she had lost. She had no doubt in her mind now. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. Beneath the photograph, hidden in a folder, Emma found another document, an adoption paper. It was yellowed with age and slightly crinkled at the edges, but it was still legible. She opened the paper slowly, her pulse racing. The adoption details were officially stamped, the signatures neat and professional. At first glance, it appeared legitimate, but something in the fine print caught Emma's eye. Her breath caught in her throat as she squinted at the words, trying to make sense of them. The document was dated several months after her supposed loss, and it listed an elderly couple as the adoptive parents. The name seemed vaguely familiar, but it was the next detail that nearly made Emma fall to her knees. The signatures. Her parents' names were right there, clearly written on the paper. Her parents had signed off on this adoption, and they had lied about the baby's death. The realization hit her like a wave, crashing over her in a rush of disbelief and anger. They had known, and they had kept the truth from her all these years. They had given her false hope, told her the child had died, when in fact they had taken her child. They had stolen her baby and given her away without a second thought. Emma's mind spun as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The adoption papers, the birthmark on Jamie's back, and now this photograph. The truth was undeniable. Jamie was her child. The little girl she had come to love and care for was the daughter she had been told was gone forever. Her hand shook as she gripped the paper, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her chest. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. For a moment, she stood there, frozen, as the truth washed over her like a flood. But then, she knew what she had to do. With shaky hands, Emma folded the adoption paper and placed it in her pocket. She wasn't going to let this go. She couldn't. The truth needed to come out, and it needed to come out now. Without a second thought, she left the library, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls as she made her way to Richard's study. He was the only one who could give her answers now. The only one who could explain why her parents had done this, why they had stolen her baby. When she reached his study, she found the door slightly ajar. She didn't knock. Her emotions were too raw, too tangled to wait. She pushed the door open without hesitation. Richard looked up from his desk, surprised to see her standing there. His expression shifted quickly from surprise to caution, as though he could sense the tension in the air. He set his pen down and leaned back in his chair, waiting for her to speak. "I need to talk to you," Emma said, her voice tight with emotion. Richard didn't say anything immediately, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he studied her. "Of course. What's going on?" Emma took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She couldn't afford to lose control now. "I found something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found something that changes everything." Richard's eyes flickered with confusion and then concern. "What do you mean?" Emma stepped forward, her heart pounding as she pulled the adoption papers from her pocket and laid them on his desk in front of him. She watched his face carefully, noting the subtle shift in his expression as he glanced down at the papers. He picked them up slowly, scanning the contents with growing disbelief. His eyes widened as he reached the part about the elderly couple, his own surprise evident. This isn't possible," Richard muttered under his breath. He looked up at Emma, his expression one of confusion and shock. "I thought I had adopted Jamie legally." "The elderly couple, what is this?" Emma's voice trembled with anger. "That elderly couple was my parents, Richard. My parents signed her away. They lied to me. They told me my child had died." Richard stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Your parents?" His face grew pale as the truth began to settle in. "They lied. They gave her away, my child, while I thought she was dead." Emma's voice cracked as she spoke, her emotions surging uncontrollably. "I need to know how this happened. I need to know everything." Richard stared at her in stunned silence, his face pale as the weight of her words sank in. "I didn't know, Emma. I didn't know." The room fell silent. The two of them locked in a moment of realization that neither of them was prepared for. The tension in the study was suffocating, the silence hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Emma stood there, her heart racing, her mind spinning as she tried to make sense of everything that had been revealed in the last few hours. She felt like she was on the edge of a precipice, the truth pulling her one way and her heart another. Richard, standing across from her, was still staring at the adoption papers in his hands, his face pale. His confusion had turned into guilt, then into something that seemed almost like panic. His eyes flickered up to meet hers, and for the first time, there was an unmistakable vulnerability in his gaze. "I didn't know, Emma," he repeated, his voice cracking slightly. "I swear I didn't know. I thought I was doing the right thing by adopting Jamie. I had no idea it was your child." Emma shook her head, the sting of the betrayal cutting deeper than she had imagined. Her parents, her own flesh and blood, had stolen her baby, given her away as if she were nothing. It was almost too much to process, and for a moment, Emma felt like she might crumble under the weight of it all. She could feel the lump in her throat growing as she fought to keep her emotions in check. "But they told me she was dead, Richard," she whispered, her voice raw with pain. "They told me that my baby was gone, that she was gone forever. I can't even imagine how that must have felt," Richard said softly, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I'm so sorry, Emma. I know that words can't fix this. But please, don't take Jamie away from me. She's been through so much already, and I—" He stopped, his voice faltering as he took a step closer to her. "Please, Emma," he said, his tone desperate. "I'm begging you. Don't take her away. I need her. We need each other. I know I've made mistakes. I know I've failed her in ways I can't undo. But please don't take her away." Emma looked at him, her heart torn in two. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the rawness of his regret. He wasn't just the cold, distant man he had once appeared to be. He was someone who, despite his faults, genuinely cared about Jamie. She could see that now, clearer than ever. And yet, she couldn't ignore the deep ache in her chest, The pain of knowing the child she thought she had lost forever had been taken from her all these years. What am I supposed to do? Emma whispered, her voice cracking. How am I supposed to process this? All these years. I thought I was the one who had lost everything, but now I find out that you're the one who took her in, that you're the one who's been raising her, not even knowing she was mine. Richard stepped forward, his voice low but firm. I'm so sorry, Emma, he said, his eyes pleading. But what matters now is what we do next. Jamie is part of this family. She's a part of me, and I want her to be a part of your life too. Please, don't take her from me. Emma felt her knees weaken as the weight of his words settled in. She wanted to scream, to run away from it all, to distance herself from the pain. But the truth was in front of her, undeniable. Jamie was her daughter. She couldn't walk away from her. The thought of tearing Jamie away from the life she had come to know, the father she had come to love, was unbearable. I don't know if I can stay here. Richard, Emma said softly, her voice filled with uncertainty. This place, this house, it's all too much. I don't even know how to begin to forgive my parents, to understand why they did this to me. Richard took a deep breath, his face softening with understanding. I can't change what's happened, Emma, but I can promise you this. I want to make things right. I want to help you build a family, a real family, with Jamie. And if you're willing, I'll help you bring your other child here to be with us. I want us all to be together as a family. Emma's heart twisted painfully as she processed his words. The idea of bringing Sam, her son, into this situation, into a life she had never planned for him, filled her with conflicting emotions. But there was a deep part of her that knew that this could be the only chance to truly make a life for both of her children, to give Jamie the family she had always deserved, and to give Sam the life that had always been out of reach. I need to talk to my parents, Emma said, her voice shaky. I need to hear them say they're sorry, to hear them admit what they did. Richard nodded, stepping back slightly to give her space. Take all the time you need, he said softly. I'll be here. We'll be here. Whenever you're ready, we'll do this together. Emma took one last, lingering look at him before she turned and walked out of the study, the weight of the decision still heavy on her shoulders. The halls of the mansion seemed colder now, the silence more profound as she made her way back to her room. She needed to make sense of everything, needed to confront the people who had betrayed her, the ones who had stolen her child. The journey back to her parents' home was a blur. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, but she knew that she couldn't move forward until she faced them. She had to hear their side, had to hear them admit the truth. Only then could she find peace. When she arrived, her parents were waiting for her, their faces filled with guilt and sorrow. The moment Emma stepped through the door, her mother rushed to her, tears already in her eyes. Emma, we are so sorry, her mother said, her voice shaking. We were wrong. We didn't know how to tell you the truth. We thought we were protecting you, but we were just keeping you from your child. Please forgive us. We never should have lied to you. Her father stood by, his face pale, his shoulders slumped in regret. We were scared, Emma. We didn't know what to do, but we were wrong. Please forgive us. Emma's heart ached as she listened to their apologies. The weight of the years of lies, of the betrayal, still hung over her. But as she looked at her parents, she saw the pain in their eyes. They had made a terrible mistake, one that could never be undone. But they were sorry, and maybe that was all that mattered now. I can't just forget what you did, Emma said softly, her voice steady but filled with sadness. But I'm willing to try for Jamie, for all of us. Her parents nodded, their eyes full of relief and remorse. We'll do anything to make it right, her father said quietly. After a long conversation, Emma made her decision. She would bring Sam back to the mansion. She would make this family whole again in whatever way she could. And so, a few days later, Emma returned to the mansion with her son, Sam. As they walked through the doors together, she felt a sense of hope, a fragile hope that perhaps this was the beginning of something better, a family united, broken by the past, but willing to heal together. In the end, they found their way. Emma, Richard, Jamie, and Sam. a family forged by circumstance but bound by love. They would rebuild together, and they would live out the rest of their days, not as individuals lost in the past, but as a family ready to face whatever came next, hand in hand. So what do you think? If you were in Emma's shoes, would you be able to forgive your parent for the lies they told and the child they took from you? Or would you walk away, unable to rebuild the trust? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional twists and unforgettable stories, because the journey isn't over yet.